Hello, and welcome to I'm That Witch, the podcast about all things witchcraft. Or is it? We have witchcraft so ingrained in our culture and pop culture that we think we know all there is to know, but what we want to do is look back at historical witches, historical alleged witches, and really look at who they were as people and what that means for us as modern witches. Hey everybody, welcome back to I'm That Witch! It's our second episode, and if you are listening to this, that means that you either really liked us or you at least did not find us intolerable in our first episode, and so thank you for that. In this episode, we get to hear from the lovely Maddy.
Oh, well, today we're going to be covering Marie Laveau, known as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. She's a central leader of the Voodoo tradition during the antebellum South, and to this day generally regarded as one of the most important figures among Louisiana's Voodoo practitioners. In the late 19th century obituaries of her death, she was cited to have healed people from deadly diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, known for powerful spells and charms that assisted her numerous clients from matters of the heart to winning court cases.
Crime and love, my two favorite things.
Exactly. She was rumored to have counseled the city's leading politicians, lawyers, and businessmen on important decision-making. Having passed more than 140 years ago, Laveau's gravesite is in the oldest cemetery in New Orleans. It's still one of the most popular tourist attractions, with many arriving with gifts to her grave. She's been popularized most recently in various media, including the show American Horror Story, Season 3, I believe. It's Coven. Yeah. So we're going to be jumping into her story today, but first of all, I think it's important that we cover what is voodoo. So we talk about witches, but voodoo is a very specific tradition. It's actually not considered a form of witchcraft or demon worship, as some might want to say it is. It's generally regarded as a religious system, and we're going to specifically be speaking about Louisiana voodoo, which arose from the combining of traditional religions of West Africa, particularly those from what's called the Dahomean. I might be, slaughtering that word right now. I apologize. It's the Dahomean religion practiced by the Fon people, which is really located where modern day Benin is. And the Roman Catholicism. There are various deities. How do you say that word?
I have heard some people say deities. I say deities.
Okay.
I don't know if there's an actual correct way to say it, or if I'm just saying that to make myself feel better about mispronouncing it.
Okay, we're gonna go with deities. Everyone can rag us in the comments about that. There are various deities worshipped in voodoo, including Blanc Donnie, the Grand Zombie, and Papa Legba, which some might recognize from the show American Horror Story, is very much centralized in the story. These deities are venerated at altars, and sacrifices are generally made to them. Voodoo generally is cited to have originated in the early 18th century when enslaved West Africans were brought to the French colony of Louisiana. It was in Louisiana that West African religious beliefs began to combine with the Roman Catholic beliefs of the French. And this continued even as Louisiana came under Spanish control and was then purchased by the United States in 1803. In the beginning of the 19th century, many migrants came during and after the Haitian Revolution, bringing with them Haitian voodoo, different from the Louisiana voodoo that we're talking about here, strengthening that tradition in New Orleans. So there are some differences. We're not going to go into the minutiae of that today, but I think it's really interesting, that kind of diaspora specific voodoo traditions and how they can be very different from each other.
That is so interesting, because I think that I never really thought too hard about how different those would look, because in my mind I think I always kind of was just like, oh yeah, voodoo, I knew about the Haitian aspect of it, the bringing in of hoodoo and voodoo and things like that, and obviously mixing in of Catholic saints after a certain amount of time, but I don't think I really thought about how different that would look based on culturally You know what I mean?
Yeah, and a lot of people in Louisiana, including Marie Laveau herself, were practicing Roman Catholics while also practicing voodoo. It's not just, this is a religion that they follow, specifically like maybe paganism, where that's their identifying religion. So I think that it's just an interesting combination. And I would like to go over the history of, how those things like the transatlantic slave trade creates these different traditions across the world, and how history influences witchcraft and voodoo as we know it. Yes. So it's important to understand those forces, and it's going to be a big part of where Marie Laveau comes from, and what brought her first to the United States. Just to kind of finish up what we're talking about, voodoo is a largely oral tradition. It has no specific sacred text or organized structure or hierarchy. Practitioners may adapt voodoo and mix it with their other religious traditions, with many also practicing Roman Catholicism, which as I just explained, Marie did so as well. And so voodoo in New Orleans consisted a lot of root work and gris-gris, which is a French word, and I cannot say it correctly. And people would generally seek out conjurers or other spiritualists for spiritual intervention or protection in their daily affairs. And that's how really Marie built her reputation in New Orleans as a very sought-after spiritualist for many people. Although never outrightly banned, the practice of voodoo was restricted through a range of laws regulating when and where Black people could gather, and it was often practiced in secret. However, in New Orleans, voodooists had to adhere to strict European laws, codes, and oppression associated with enslavement, and it was often under pretty clear scrutiny by public officials in the law, and many of newspapers that have been archived from that time show this kind of fascination, but also a taboo element related to voodoo, because it was primarily practiced by freed and enslaved Black people at the time. So going into Marie Laveau's history, it's very much not well documented, like our friend Bridgette from the last episode. It still remains shrouded in a lot of mystery and rumor. Some documents indicate she may have been born in 1794, while other research supports her being born in 1801. But it's between those kind of years that she's born. And she's reportedly born to an African woman named Marguerite d'Arcantel and Charles Laveau. The most popular story of her birth, that's very much popularized, was that her father was a rich white planter who was prominent in public affairs, and her mother was a Black woman and his possible mistress. In reality, what researchers found kind of going through archival documents is that both of her parents were believed to have been of mixed race. Marie's great-grandparents were believed to have been enslaved and brought to Louisiana from the area of Senegal, and her maternal grandmother, Catherine, purchased her freedom from Francois Pomé, bought land on St. Anne Street, where she commissioned the construction of the house that would later become the home of Marie Laveau. That was very much visited by everyone in the community. Marie's mother, Marguerite, was later freed in 1790 and had a child with Charles Laveau. Obviously, Marie, a prosperous freedman who was known at the time and seems to be of confirmed, traded in real estate, owned business, but also dealt in the slave trade as well. Okay. So let's go into her background of where does she come from. Her parents were reported to be active members of the cathedral, and Maria did remain a member of the Catholic Church throughout her life, even though she began to practice voodoo later on and around her 20s and 30s, it seems like. Marie ended up marrying a Creole man from Haiti named Jacques Paris in 1819, who disappeared mysteriously around 1822, so only 3 years later he's disappeared. She began referring to herself as the Widow Paris, or Widow Paris. After the reported death of her husband, Laveau started a relationship with Jean-Louis Christophe Glapion. I am butchering all these names, so I apologize.
I'm still stuck on how Jacques Paris sounds like a Saturday Night Live character or something, like, ho ho ho, I am a Jacques Paris.
Yeah, and that might be my accent, so I apologize to all French people that may be listening.
And I apologize to all French people who might have the name Jacques Paris, who are terribly offended right now. That's my name.
Exactly. And so obituaries state that she was estimated to have almost 15 children with Glapion, her second husband, with at least documentation of 7 of those between the pair. Laveau is known to have become a hairdresser to support her family, and then it's believed that sometime between the 1820s and 1830s, so she's in her 20s and 30s, she assumed leadership of a congregation and began to hold weekly ceremonies at her home at St. Anne Street, the home that had been built by her grandmother, as we discussed earlier. So much documentation by newspapers during this time was not on voodoo practice, but rather the police disruption of ceremonies and arrest of participants for the, quote, illegal assembly. So researchers later on in the 20th century interviewed people who had actually lived on St. Anne Street in the neighborhood who had known Marie Laveau to get their kind of sense of what was going on, because newspapers weren't as accurate in terms of reporting on what was actually going on in voodoo tradition and the practices. It was more taboo, more not glamorization, but what would the word be, that sensationalizing the practice rather than describing accurately what is exactly happening at Marie Laveau's house in these big traditions where the people are getting together. So one witness, Marie Didet, grew up in the St. Anne neighborhood and went to play with Marie's grandchildren when she was younger. They were never allowed in the front room of the house, which was used for services, but peeping through the cracks, she remembers seeing many candles lit. Many altars were described of St. Peter and St. Maron. St. Peter is analogous to the Haitian voodoo spirit Legba, who had mentioned before. He's believed to open the door to the spirit world and guard the home against intruders and invite customers into one's place of business.
That's really interesting that, because like in the Catholic faith, St. Peter is the one who guards the gates of heaven, essentially. Like St. Peter opens the gates of heaven for people who are coming in after they've died, so that's a really interesting overlap. Yeah. I love that.
It was, I believe, Marie crossing over those Roman Catholic beliefs with voodoo tradition.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One witness reports a back room where Marie had an altar only for charms and work that was meant for killing, to drive away people, to break up love affairs, or spread confusion. And so we had mentioned before that, people used to go see Marie for any kind of consultation. So that included politicians, businessmen. Who knows what she was doing in those back rooms, hoping to, make these politicians' dreams come true, to help businessmen maybe screw over their competition. Not everything she did was always in the good of, bringing you good fortune. It was to potentially be used against other people. So Marie held weekly ceremonies in her home for her followers. In addition, Marie gave private consultations and made and sold gris. People sought her advice for marital affairs, domestic disputes, judicial issues, childbearing, finances, health, and good luck. Various accounts document Marie being paid large sums of money by city officials, lawyers, and judges. As a queen to the community, Laveau predominantly orchestrated rituals at 3 main sites: her home on St. Anne Street, Congo Square, and Lake, again I'm going to butcher it, Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain. Okay,
I only want to say that.
Lake Pontchartrain.
Chartrain? Pontchartrain?
Oh, God.
I don't know. I made it 10 times worse. I know, one phrase in French, and it is, I would like something to eat.
I regret doing something where the majority of it was going to be French or French Creole names.
Okay, next week I'll just do something German, and then we can all laugh at
Yeah,
me.
exactly. So at Laveau's home on St. Anne Street, Laveau would converse with clients who would meet with her regarding any issues they were having. In her backyard, she would also have ceremonies in which she conjured the spirit of the great zombie, the deity Dambala Wido, who would manifest through a snake. The second major ritualistic space, the Congo Square, was a public space that was set aside by city officials as a gathering place for both enslaved and freed African people. Laveau would gather her followers there on Sundays to dance and worship. No major ceremonies would take place here, but it was a place of spiritual gathering and rejuvenation for Africans who experienced major oppression and hardships both on the plantation and as free citizens. The last place of significance that was presided over by Laveau was Bayou St. John's. That I think is which was located on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain. It was here that major ceremonies took place among the initiated in Voodoo. Laveau would often be accompanied by her, quote, king, or what was known as a second-ranking male officiate. To say. Singing, dancing, drumming, and spirit possession would generally occur in these gatherings. Marie maintained her queenship among the community up until retiring from the congregation in 1869 and eventually passing away on June 15th, 1881. Witnesses report her funeral was very lavish and attended by a large crowd. There were many voodoo priestesses in 19th century New Orleans. So why does Marie Laveau endure more than others that we might know of? In addition to her spiritual gifts, she appears to have possessed beauty, charisma, and a flair for showmanship that made her stand out in a way that other queens may not have. She was also connected by blood and partnership to several prestigious Creole families of both European and African descent, as we kind of discussed where she came from in terms of both her maternal and paternal side. She has many connections to people in the community there and quickly kind of rose in that ascent. And so that's the overview of Marie's life. There's not a lot known about her. It's a lot that's popularized and sensationalized in media, but I think she's such an interesting person and practitioner that I thought we have to cover her in our second episode.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that I'm trying to think like how I was going to phrase this because it popped into my mind. But it's interesting because I know one of the things that we talked about in our first episode and like in our introduction to the podcast was that, we started off being like, let's talk about witches, and then realizing beyond just what we know that so many people that we see as witches were really just people who, oftentimes women, not always women, but people who had power that others did not want them to have, or people who were seen as different in some way. Yeah. And so I think that it's awesome that we were able to do Marie Laveau and look at her life and everything, because looking at it, she's a voodoo priestess. She's not what one would classically probably consider a witch, even though she's kind of come into our consciousness as a witchy type figure, especially with American Horror Story, which there are things that you talked about that even made me think of that show, where I was like, wow, it's interesting. You mentioned she had a business as a hairdresser, and they incorporated that into the show, which I think is really interesting. She owned a hair salon, and I'm like, oh, yes. Is that why they did that? That makes sense.
And when I'm looking at the research about how does she make that transition from being a hairdresser to being this voodoo queen, being a hairdresser, she actually worked for a lot of the very prominent women in New Orleans, both black and white, and that was how she kind of amassed this trust among a lot of people in New Orleans, that they confided in her, that she learned many of the secrets of these families and these women that aided her in her practice, I would assume aided her in the practice of consulting all these different families and individuals, because she was a trusted member of the society already.
Yeah, and that makes sense. My mom, before she went to nursing school, she was a nail tech and an esthetician, and so I spent most of my childhood in nail salons, as we've talked about, just getting high off of the smell of acrylic. Permanent brain damage, I'm sure.
That's why we're here.
Exactly. That's how we ended up here.
Shared brain trauma.
But that's so true, because like I think about like my childhood spent in, and like my young adulthood and stuff spent in these like salons where it's like all of these, you know, once again, typically women, not always, but typically women would gather together in this space, and everybody was just like, oh my gosh, like, you know, April, what was your husband doing? Or like, you know, Janine, you know, can you believe that so-and-so said this? And it's like, I don't want to say like a gossip fest, but it's like everyone kind of in one spot where it's like everyone knew each other, everyone was talking about their personal lives, and it kind of becomes like almost like a gathering or a ceremony in itself, that it's like you have your regular appointment that you come in and all the same people are there and you all talk, you know? Mm-hmm. But I think it's, sorry, I'm going to like, let me just commandeer this whole conversation. I think it's interesting though, because you were talking, I wanted to like go back and touch on how you were talking about like not all good and not all bad working, but I didn't want to interrupt you when you were like talking about it. But I think that that is something that is so interesting to me, because I see it so much in witchcraft as well, that people perceive witchcraft as being a religion, and it's not necessarily. Some people do like have witchcraft as part of their religion, but typically it's separated into like there's religion and there's craft. Usually like something like Wicca would be a religion that incorporates witchcraft. But there are Christian witches, there are Buddhist witches, there are all kinds of different like pagan and heathen and all these things where you have your religion separate from your craft, even atheist witches. And I think that it's so interesting that that we see kind of that same like light work and shadow work in witchcraft as well, like as a practice more than a faith. And I'm very purposefully trying to avoid, like, I don't particularly like the phrases like white magic and black magic, because I feel like there's a lot of undertones there that even I don't fully understand the history of. But like light work and shadow work, to me, like they're both part of us, and they're important to use together. And so I've met witches before who are like, I under no circumstances will do any kind of negative spell work. I'll never like do anything against somebody else. And there's this idea of like, they call it the threefold law. Whatever you put out comes back to you times 3. And some people don't necessarily understand that like that's very rooted in Wicca, which is a very like positivity only sort of religious context. I'm going to avoid saying too much because I have my own thoughts on Wicca as it pertains to its own problematic history, and there's a lot of appropriation in that as well. And I don't want to offend people who are Wiccan, like, you know, your beliefs are your beliefs, but to me, part of the beauty of witchcraft, or something like voodoo, presumably as well, being a craft and a practice, is that you're kind of turning the mirror back on yourself and looking at the nature of like what it is to be human. And I don't know, I just think that's really interesting. That to me is what separates craft from religion, because you're examining what it means to be human rather than focusing so much on the divine.
I think that what drew me so much to Marie Laveau's story is that kind of dichotomy of having the religious side of the Roman Catholic side of things for her, and then the voodoo witchcraft tradition. And I think the history behind it is also so important, because when I thought about what is the common person's perception of what voodoo is, it generally is negative connotated. It's generally understood as some kind of negative spell work on to, wish poorly on someone else, to wish bad things to happen to someone else. And when you look at the history of it and how it's being perceived by primarily white European people, colonizers, and their perception of it, and that's why it comes into, you know, the modern day perception of like, well, it's bad, so we just avoid it. Same thing with, you know, people probably can say about witchcraft and paganism and Wicca, is that all these things are bad. They don't have any positive element to them in any way, when we know, based on, you know, the research into what was going on in these practices, is that it was very much giving a comfort to many people who were undergoing the oppression of Jim Crow. Well, not Jim Crow, this was the antebellum period. So, I mean, you still have people who are enslaved, and you have, you know, freed Black people who were, you know, struggling to just make it in society, even though it was a very different thing for New Orleans versus maybe somewhere else in the South. It's a very much a comforting tradition. It was very much used by Marie to bring good fortune and hopefully to guide people in their lives and their affairs. So I think it's important to highlight the two elements because that's not generally what's told to us or maybe perpetuated in mainstream media about these kind of other traditions outside of a Judeo-Christian religion, if that makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that is much of like a bad rap as witchcraft can sometimes get. I can only imagine that that kind of increases all the more for something like voodoo, because it is based in like non-European culture. And, you know, historically that is something that people of European descent see as like an inherently bad thing on it, like in and of itself. So it turns into, it goes beyond just, you know, witches and devil worship, and it turns into, I feel like you hear a lot of terminology kind of almost categorizing as some kind of like savagery, you know, or like something like, oh, like pins in dolls and like, you know, killing chickens and things that are that evoke these like kind of visceral reactions or images in your mind of something that we've been told is like the worst, or like, and it makes me wonder. I think that it's interesting that Marie Laveau was able to practice that so publicly and openly and serve so many people with it, because it seems like in a lot of ways she kind of was like the bridge between a lot of different kinds of worlds. And I wonder how much of that was her connections, how much of it might have been her being like mixed race, that she was able to kind of captivate an audience of so many diverse cultures and walks of life, and do so in a way that that she's gone down in history for it. I think it's really interesting. It seems like, you know, you were saying like medical matters, childbirth, legal matters. It's like she was really out here doing it all. She was a doctor, she was a lawyer, she was a midwife, she was a hairdresser, she was
consulted to the stars.
She was a woman of God.
She was doing everything, and I think that her legacy has lived on in terms of how many people do still practice voodoo even today throughout the South, which I think is important to highlight, is that a lot of people still practice voodoo traditions, both Black and white. It's non-discriminatory, but it's interesting that kind of like how has it developed over time, and it's still practiced. Her gravesite is still very much a popular tourist attraction for many to come and visit, and I think that it keeps alive different traditions other than what we know of or what we're familiar with. So thank you for on this journey of Marie Laveau's life. This was an abbreviated version of all the different research that's kind of been done on her, but there's just not so many documents to say, you know, what exactly occurred in her life. So it's still shrouded in mystery, but if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like. Throw in the comments what you think about the episode, what we could be doing different, what you'd like to hear from us, maybe some witches or events in history you might want to hear about.
Absolutely. Subscribe, share with your friends. You know, we appreciate all of it because we like to talk and we hope you like to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm That Witch is researched, written, and hosted by Maddy Guerra and Bridgette Golden, edited by Bridgette Golden. You can find more episodes on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find us on social media on Instagram at LoveWitchSpells or TikTok at LoveWitchSpells13. Make sure to like and subscribe if you liked what you heard today and want to hear more. Thanks for listening.